All right. We're going to talk today about the infoSecure product and a little bit about how to configure a policy. So let's imagine that, well, first of all, the solution for infoSecure is a centralized tool across one or more data environments where you leverage consistent policies down to the cell level across your entire enterprise landscape. So here would be an example. Just as a primer. The infoSecure policies at the top could be managed within, say, your data warehouse, but also those same policies could be replicated into other systems like your other sources or other data stores, we'll call them. That way, we can create a set of views over the data that causes them to be masked and filtered at query time, so that all consumers of the data are playing by the same rules when it comes to metadata policies or access management policies. We call them meta policies because in infoSecure, we define them with metadata, and that's going to be the configuration of that metadata that we show you today. So we're going to be creating meta policies. So let's talk a little bit about what that actually entails, okay? Well, most people familiar with access management understand the user and role association. A role is a hat that a user might wear. Some people call them groups. You can put users into groups. A group can be in one or more groups. A user can be in one or more groups. A group can have, obviously, many users associated to it. So there's a many-to-many relationship between the users and their roles, okay? But ultimately, I need to correct this real quick. Ultimately, we need a way to associate the data that the users can see based on what roles those users play. We need to be able to associate that with the data over here on the right. And the way we do that is by creating what we call an infoSecure categories. And categories can be filters. They can be used as filters for rows in your data set. They can be used as flags or tags for columns in your data set. And they can be leveraged to implement masking policies as well as filtering policies. So when you take a role and you map it to a set of categories, you've created a policy, so to speak. In infoSecure, we call these rules, these sets of rules, which are made up of categories, we call those classes. And when you map them to a role, then you've created your first policy. So the whole point of this demonstration today is going to be to create a policy that maps data categories with the users via roles that those users play, okay? And we're going to use the term class to define sets of values that make up these categories. So let's take that and let's go into the infoSecure user interface. Okay? You should have access to this. When you run it, it shows a set of initial categories. These are things that come out of the box. These are kind of special types of categories in infoSecure. But we're going to add one. We're going to call it, and just so it shows up at the top, we're going to call it a transaction type. Because we're going to be securing a set of data based on the transaction types within that data, okay? So now down here at the bottom, here's a transaction type. We're going to go ahead and add a few values to that. We're going to say that you could have a transaction type called sale, right? And you could have another one called, these are the domain values, maybe a fee, and maybe another type of transaction would be a payment, okay? So fees, payments, and sales are three transaction types. So we went ahead and defined the domain for transaction type, all right? Well, that's important because now when we create a class, a set of rules based on that transaction type, we're gonna say a rule for payments. All right. When we create this rule, Scroll down to the bottom, a rule for payments. There it is. I'm going to add an element to this class to tell it that this payment, this class creates a rule for transaction types of payments. And we're going to match on any one of these values. We're going to say we're going to match on the equal. So it has to, the transaction type in that row of data has to equal payment. We could, if payment was a minimum amount, we might choose the transaction type minimum here. But for the purpose of this demonstration, we're going to say it has to match exactly. It has to be equal to the payment type, or sorry, the transaction type has to equal payment. All right. We're going to add one more thing to this class. It's grouping capability. Now we're going to make this you can see we have plural range, singular type classes. We're going to make this a singular class, which means you only need to match on one column within your data set in order to match this class. And in this case, it's the transaction type column, and it would be looking for the value of payment. If we only wanted to show payments in, say, the Northwest region, we'd make that a plural class, plural meaning more than one. And then we would have, instead of a singular class, we'd make this plural, and then we'd add the Northwest region, a region Northwest, something like this. We'd select the region category and add the West region to that category. And in doing so, want the match type. Now we have a plural class. All right. This would say you can see payments in the West region. But for the purpose of this demo, and then we'd have to change this to plural right here. Plural. Okay. Likewise, you could create a range class where you said a given class is valid for any transactions between A and Q in the alphabet. Okay. So that would be another type of class. So we have singular, plural, and range. In this case, I'm going to delete this region out of it so we can just create kind of the basic unit of a category, of a class with one category, transaction type of payment. Now we need to assign that class, this payments elements, okay, this payment class, we need to assign it to either a user or a role. So let's pick a user out of here. I'm going to pick myself. I'm going to give myself a role of admin. I'm already in the admin role. If I wanted to add myself to another role, I could do so. I could make myself also a viewer within this class, right? And each of these roles then are associated, as we showed in our slide here. Each role is associated with a set of categories, also defined in a class, to make a policy, all right? So right now, what we have is me assigned to a couple roles, but what's not very interesting is that we have this class that we created, a rule for payments, but it sits out here and it's not associated with anybody. It's not associated with anything. So we're going to go into the role admin, which I'm a part of, and we're going to add that class to the admin class, to the admin role, a rule for payments. And by doing so, now we've created an association between there we go. We've associated the admin role to the rule for payment class. And we did so just by pushing this add button on the role. Now there's a couple other ways to manage which users are in which roles. Before I go on, I want to say now we've completed the whole spectrum of the definition of a policy. We defined a category called transaction type. We defined its values, its domain values, fees, payments, and sales. And then we associated one of those domain values in a class to a role that we assign my username to that role. So now you've got this user, me, connected to the role, admin, connected to the class, a transaction or a rule for payments, right? And then that payments will be married to the data in the creation of the actual view that infoSecur can generate with this metadata. Now we're not going to go into creating that view because for today, this training is focused just on the management of the policies themselves. But now this policy, a rule for payments, is associated with the admin role. And if we look at that policy, it gives access only to the payment rows. Now, we might say, I want to see payments, not only payments, but I also want to see maybe sales as well. Any sale that matches on equal, right? So now we have two rows in this class. My question is it still a singular class? There's two rows in this class that identify two different values that make up this class. So is this still a singular class? It's a trick question. The answer is yes, this is still a singular class because both of these values have the same category ID. And since they're both of the same category, we only need to know about a single column in the resulting data set in order to evaluate whether it's a payment or sale. So this is kind of like an or relationship. I have to be a payment or a sale transaction in order to match this particular class. So we can add as many elements as we want to a singular class as long as they're all the same category ID. Okay. Now, I want to talk just for a moment about another type of class. So we've talked about singular, plural. I want to create one more type of class called a range class. All right. Now, for a range class, you might have an element within your data that's numeric in value, or it could be alphabetical, but let's use a numeric one because we're going to create a range that's kind of easy to identify numeric values. Okay, so maybe we're going to call this a number range. Okay, and even better yet, let's be more specific. Let's say this is an age range. Okay, so we want to create a policy that shows data only for people under the age of 18 or over the age of 21 or something like that. All right, so we're going to create a policy called age. I don't want to create range yet. I'm just creating a category. So the category is the definition of the age. So we're going to call it age, and we're going to add to age. By the way, you can filter. If you have a list of policies, you can filter by part, or a list of classes or categories. You can filter by part of their name here, and it matches. So now I'm going to click on that age, and I'm going to add some values. We're going to have the age of 0 years. We're going to have the age of 18 years. That might be an important date. Maybe 21 years is important for those young adults out there. And then maybe the rest of us don't have anything to look forward to until we retire, right? So we just added 4 important age values into the age category. Okay? That's all we've done so far. Now I'm going to create a class that defines a range of ages. Okay, so now we'll call this class a rule for ages. Doesn't matter what we name it, but it's good to be somewhat descriptive when you name that class. Now, if I scroll down here and click, it's a little deceiving here. Let me go back. It's a little deceiving because you've got this little pencil here. And a lot of people, when they want to modify this class, add elements to it, they'll click on this right here. And all that does is allow you to change the name. We could change the name to something else new here, right? I'm going to cancel that because we really don't want to change the name. We don't want to delete it. We want to modify the elements in that class. So that's why we click on the name of it, to change the elements. We're going to add, first of all, we're going to tell it that we're going to be grouping. The grouping type of this class is it's a range. Okay. And then we're going to add a minimum and or maximum value for that range. So let's say we're gonna start with age 0, and that's the minimum. And the next value, we're gonna say age up to from 0 to age 18. Okay, and age 18 is the max. So now we've created a class called a rule for ages. All right, and this is a range of ages from minimum of 0 to a maximum of 18. Whether that's inclusive or exclusive depends on how it's implemented in the view, which we're not going to show today. But that's a question that often comes up. Is that inclusive or exclusive? It depends. It depends on how you implement this policy in the view that filters by this data. But we've just created a range class from 0 to 18. Now we're going to go find a role that user, let's pick a new user here, Sally. We're going to give Sally, we're going to take her off the viewer role, and we're going to add a role. We're going to make Sally a data scientist, okay? And we're going to give the data scientist role, I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to say that data scientist gets to see any data for ages 0 to 18. And oh, why not? Let's also give that data scientist access to transaction types of payments. So now that data scientist can see both of those classes. Oftentimes this is used to manage, say, data in rows and data in columns. Maybe you want to filter payments, but only but then only show the age if they're between the age of 0 to 18. Okay, otherwise maybe the adults don't want someone to know their age. So that's why you would create a class with a role with multiple classes in it, because you have multiple different rules that both apply to that same role. And that about wraps it up. That's 2 examples of how we created a class and associated it to a role. I did want to mention one other thing here, and that is that users can have roles assigned to them, like we did with myself and with Sally here. Sally's a data scientist. But users can also have classes assigned to them directly. So a user doesn't have to be associated to a role to create a policy for a user. We go back to look at this slide right here. You'll notice that users are associated to roles, and categories are made into rules, which creates a policy, right? You actually can have a policy that excludes the roles where the user is associated directly to a class. And here's how you do that. You just, instead of under roles for Sally, you click on classes, and you can assign any of those classes that were previously defined into the user directly as well. Now, I don't recommend doing this. So then you might ask, well, then why did you show us if you don't recommend doing that? We allow classes to be associated directly to users for really 2 reasons. One is that sometimes users don't need roles to have permissions assigned to them. So it creates extra metadata, extra complexity in the policies if a user should have a class assigned directly to them rather than creating a role first. So that's one reason. It just simplifies the management, but it undermines to some extent the reuse of policies as they can be implemented with roles. So a role is more reusable. Assigning a class directly to the user is a little less complicated. There's one less step in the process. So that's one reason why we would assign classes directly to users. The second reason is for the purpose of exceptions. Let's say that Sally had access to everyone from ages 0 to 18, except 18-year-olds. Maybe you don't want, or maybe 17 and 18-year-olds are, maybe there's some magic that happens at the age of 16, and 17 and 18-year-olds should be excluded from access. But Sally is the only person in the database that you want to exclude those from. What we would do is we would create a class called an exception class. I'll show you how to do that. We'll call this a age exception. All right, and we're going to create this exception class. And the only thing that makes it an exception class is that instead of a group called plural, range, and singular, we're going to go to the match type here, and we're going to create, not match type, sorry, group. We're going to create another value. I thought this was already done. We're going to create another value in the grouped. Grouped is a special category. It's used for metadata within infoSecur, not metadata to correlate to the client's data. We're going to add to this a value called exception. All right. And now, when we go to the class, a rule for ages. Oh, sorry. No, we weren't gonna associate. We weren't gonna update. Yes. Thought we created one called an age exception. There it is, an age exception. Now we can assign the grouped value of exception to this. And now we've created a type of class where it essentially revokes. An exception class revokes permissions. So now we're going to add to this exception class what ages we want revoked from this. And let's select the value 18. So if they have the value 18, we're actually going to revoke it. And now we're going to go over to the user, Sally, and we're going to explicitly add that exception class to her user, an age exception. So now, because Sally has the role of data scientist, she can see, if we look at the role, she can see a rule for ages, which is 0 to 18, right? Rule for ages gives access to 0 to 18, right? But now, whoops, I clicked on the wrong one. Rule for ages, there we go. 0 to 18, a range group. But we've explicitly, through the class an age exception, we've said you can't see age 18. So because Sally has the data scientist role, that gives her access to see 0 through 18, but the exception class takes away her privilege to see 18. Now, the exception classes don't have to be applied at the user level. They can be applied at the role level. But what we found in practice is that typically exceptions are applied to individuals, whereas the general rule is applied to roles, which are then applied to individuals. So for the most part, we don't use classes associated directly to users, except for exception scenarios. Although it will work with any scenario, that is the best practice. To use exceptions as classes assigned directly to users, and everything else, use them as classes assigned to roles, which are in turn defined as users. So going back to our slideshow, we created a category called transaction, and we created a category called age. We added values to those categories. Then we created a class for the transaction type of payments and sales. And we created another class for the age range of 0 to 18. And we created another class with an exception of the age 18. And then we assigned those categories to, those classes to roles to create a policy. Some of those roles were assigned to users. In another case, in a special exception case, we had a class, an exception class that we assign directly to Sally to remove her or revoke her privilege to see 18-year-old data. And that ends the demo on creating policies in infoSecur.